Marshall Plan to aid 16 members, European countries from 1948 to 52 is arguably, now you might say, given where I'm from, I'm somewhat biased on this issue, but arguably the most successful program for post-war economic recovery in world history. But I think it's important to recognize that it teaches both the donor and the recipient of post-war aid important economic and political lessons. First of all, the Marshall Plan highlights the importance of making a large and adequate, sustained economic commitment to post-war economic recovery. In fact, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall noted so himself when he testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations in January 1948, in which he said, "The objective of the European Recovery Program is to achieve lasting economic recovery for Western Europe. Recovery in the sense that after our aid has terminated, the European countries will be able to maintain themselves by their own efforts on a sound economic basis. An inadequate program would involve a wastage of our resources with an ineffective result. Either undertake to meet the requirements of the problem or do not undertake it at all." And I think it's worth noting, the Marshall Plan was big. There was $13.3 billion appropriated by Congress from 1948 to 52, which is the rough equivalent of $130 billion in today's 2022 dollars. 90% of those funds were grants, and they were front-loaded, amounting to about 2% of U.S. GDP in the first year of the Marshall Plan in 1948. Now, for comparison's sake, 2% of EU 27 GDP in 2022 of about 15.8 trillion euros would approximate $300 billion. 300 billion euros. In other words, the initial financial burden taken on by the United States in the late 40s far exceeds that which to date has been agreed by the European Union for Ukraine. Now, it should be noted that there is a population issue here. About 70 million Europeans lived in the 16 countries that received Marshall aid in the late 1940s. That compares to about 40 million Ukrainians today, so about 15% of the original recipients of the Marshall Plan live in Ukraine today. So if you scale to population, you will see that the first-year commitment in 1948 would approximate an outlay by the EU of about 45 billion euros, which again means that however you cut the cake, despite its proximity, Europe has yet to match for Ukraine the American generosity it itself enjoyed at the outset of the Marshall Plan. And it should be noted, of course, that the Marshall Plan did not include, and the numbers that I give you did not include, the military aid that the United States also provided to Europe in the late 1940s. Now, at the same time, of course, reconstruction of Ukraine has not yet fully commenced, and the EU will have future opportunities to scale up its financial assistance to Ukraine. But the scale of the Marshall Plan of the 1940s certainly highlights the challenging economic challenge facing the EU as it approaches these still unmet costs of reconstruction. And there I think it's worth recalling that there are many traditionally frugal or so-called frugal members of the EU that are typically skeptical of common EU-level financial commitments that are also today, often, I would argue, among the most vocal supporters of Ukraine in the EU. And I would submit today that especially this group of mostly Northern and Eastern European member states, they really do face a choice between their traditional EU-level frugality and the sizable long-term economic commitments to Ukraine that the Marshall Plan embodied, and which I would contend only can be met if implemented at the EU level. The basic question is that, do you want to remain traditionally frugal and skeptical of common EU financial outlays, or do you favor the timely and comprehensive Ukrainian reconstruction that could propel Kyiv's expeditious accession to the EU? There has to be a choice made. I don't think you can have it both ways. Secondly, I think it's important to note that the Marshall Plan highlights that successful recovery aid isn't charity. It's not something Europe does or the United States did in the 1940s because they're nice. It's assistance granted to a country when it is solely or exclusively, overwhelmingly in the national self-interest of the donor. Again, if you listen to what George Marshall told the Senate, when he basically talked about the rationale for his plan, he said a nation cannot embark on an undertaking of such magnitude and significance for light or purely sentimental reasons. Decisions of this importance are dictated by the highest consideration of national interest. Certainly, that is also the case today with regards to Ukraine, because only then will it be politically feasible to appropriate adequate financial sums and sustain the effort over multiple years. And indeed, only then will it be possible to invest, only if governments are willing to invest a sizable, often, domestic political capital in swaying domestic public opinion in favor of such aid. There's no doubt that many Americans in the 1940s wanted to help Europe, but ultimately, the United States government assisted Western Europe after 1948, partly to prevent communist parties to take power in Western European countries, but partly to help generate, in due time, new export markets for American firms. And I think it's also clear that EU funds that would help rebuild Ukraine today should be granted with the same clear-eyed view of what Europe's interests are. A successfully rebuilt and vibrant market economy in Ukraine will certainly better carry part of the defense burden of deterring future renewed Russian aggression, thereby, of course, also providing territorial security for EU members. And it's certainly the case that a rapidly growing Ukrainian post-war economy will also purchase a large amount of EU exports, which is an economic scenario that certainly those member states that often takes a particular pride in the scale of their trade surpluses should recall. And thirdly, I think it's clear that the Marshall Plan, with its explicit policy conditionality and demand for a sizable European counterparty funds to complement the American aid of the 1940s, really embody the need for recipient countries to now do things differently than they did before the war, and of course also put their own resources to use for their recovery. Again, George Marshall made it clear when he said, the concept of American assistance to Europe has been based on the premise that European initiative and cooperation are prerequisite for European recovery. Only Europeans themselves can finally solve their problem. So while undoubtedly the US government exerted firm control over the use of resources made available to Europe, starting with the formation of the Committee of European Economic Cooperation in the summer of 1947, it was actually the European nations themselves that spearheaded the identification of production target areas, reduction in regional trade barriers, and the promotion of internal monetary and financial stability that accompanied the Marshall Plan's financial aid. EU accession and ultimately adoption of the EU acquis will invariably put great political strains and reform needs on Ukraine, and will certainly grant the EU arguably unprecedented political influence in Kyiv. But however, to be ultimately successful, EU financial assistance and the accession process itself must, like the Marshall Plan, I would argue, embody a partnership that unleashes the domestic reform urge and initiative of Ukrainians to successfully propel their country towards the type of rules-based and entrepreneurial economic revival that the country needs. Only then can Ukraine's European integration, transparent government, and improved living standards be secured. Okay. I have a final statement, but I will. Okay. Yes, please. Okay, but let me finally say, and I think this is an important final word on the economic prospects for Ukrainian recovery. It is basically the case that developed countries such as Ukraine, when they recover from a war that has been won, provided that they retain responsive democratic governance institutions, have access to adequate financial resources, including obviously overseas aid, foreign investment from the private sector, and broad international market access, they tend to recover very rapidly from the tragedy of war. And I think it's fair to say that Ukraine may very well get access to adequate reconstruction aid from mostly the EU. They will have the market access obviously embodied in the EU Association Agreement and the continued suspension of Ukrainian import duties to the European Union. If you add to that the growth boost for reconstruction, the legal modernization and business predictability coming from adopting the acquis, Ukraine's post-war growth prospects are very good indeed. In line with earlier successful EU accessions, Ukraine, given considerably lower labor costs compared to existing EU members and already present market access, should expect large inflows of foreign direct investments. And this is particularly the case at a time when many multinational firms are looking to diversify their operations away from China and will be looking for production locations in or near the EU to supply the European markets. The economic base case for post-war Ukraine is therefore that Ukraine will, with adequate financial assistance, easily outgrow China and virtually every other emerging market in the 10 years after the end of the war, and hereby become an important growth driver for the entire European region. So I hope, as my closing remark, that European policymakers and governments will remember these very good economic growth prospects for Ukraine as they contemplate the scale of future financial aid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.